I'm here today to talk about foreign policy, actually. It's about how a libertarian or a non-interventionist should approach the world. Now, admittedly, this is a complicated subject because folks on the broad right of the political and ideological spectrum have different views about foreign policy. But before I explain what I think Australia should do in the world, let me just debunk what I see as three myths that reflect the elite's attitudes towards public affairs, or at least foreign policy. The first myth is that we are living in the most uncertain, unpredictable, volatile times in living memory. And you'll often hear this. If you read the government's white paper that was released a few months ago, you'll see the words unprecedented, unpredictable, volatile, lit all across the report. And it is true, of course, that with the rise of China and Donald Trump's rise and Brexit, Islamic terror, problems in the Middle East, the digital evolution of the global economy, they are very unsettling times for people who do follow international affairs. But is this really more volatile and unpredictable than, say, the late 40s or throughout the 1950s, the early to mid stages of the Cold War, when we in Australia had to deal with the end of empire, the rise of decolonisation, the rise of Asian nationalism, and of course communism? Is it really so unpredictable and volatile as that period? Are we living in more unpredictable and uncertain times as the late 60s, when the British withdrew its naval force from east of Suez, or when President Richard Nixon went to Guam, famously declaring the end of American guarantees, security guarantees to its allies? That led to a sense of widespread disillusionment in Canberra. Is it more unsettling than, say, the end of the Cold War in the late 80s and early 1990s, when we were told it was the end of history? When Gareth Evans, who was the foreign minister at the time, said recently about that period, that was the most volatile and unpredictable period in international relations. I mean, you'll often hear this. The era we're living in now, is it more unpredictable and volatile than, say, the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington? I don't think so. I think you should bear all that in mind when you hear people say we're living in the most uncertain period in international relations in living memory. The other myth you'll often hear is that we in Australia don't have an independent foreign policy, that we're lickspittles of what Robert Menzies called our great and powerful friends. And again, it's true that from 1901, when we became an independent state, right through to the 40s and 50s, we did hitch our security to Great Britain, the mother country. And of course, since the onset of the Cold War in the 50s, it's been the United States. But that does not mean Australia has been a lickspittle of our great and powerful friends. Just think how this country expressed its independence within and sometimes without the empire in the first decades of the 20th century. The distinguished diplomatic historian Neville Maney has documented in great detail how our leaders clashed with their counterparts in Whitehall when they felt that Australia's distinctive interests clashed with the mother country. Have we forgotten about Menzies' decision to delay sending Australian troops to the Middle East at the outbreak of World War II? Have we forgotten about Gough Whitlam's ministers in the early 1970s? As soon as Gough was elected in late 1972, Jim Cairns, Tom Uren, Clyde Cameron, they all said that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were fascists and madmen and murderers for the bombing of Hanoi. That didn't seem like someone who were towing the American line. What about Bob Hawke's decision to withdraw from our participation in the MX missiles in the 1980s? Again, there's lots of examples that indicate that Australia has often taken issue with our great and powerful friends. Now, in recent times, we've had a lot of former diplomats like Bruce Grant and Alison Bronowski. They'll all too often say that since the Howard era, we have been lickspittles of the Americans. But just look at Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott went to great lengths, despite the Obama administration's lobbying, to support our inclusion in the China-led Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Look at Malcolm Turnbull. Despite all the lobbying from the Pentagon over the last 3 or so years, Australia has refrained from doing our own freedom of navigation patrols through that contentious area in the South China Sea. So bear all that in mind when you hear people say we have no independent foreign policy. The third and final myth I want to just puncture before I talk about what I think we should do is this notion that China's rise means that America is going to be displaced as the main regional power or hegemon in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, one can't deny that China has emerged on the global stage, and as its strategic interests change, as its power increases, it's more than likely that China would like to assert a sphere of influence in what it sees as its backyard. It's also true that US credibility and prestige and influence have waned somewhat since what I think was the disastrous decision to invade Iraq in 2003. Having said all that, across most of Asia, there remains a well-founded conviction that the US will remain the predominant power in defence, innovation, energy self-sufficiency, education. Demographic trends are working crucially in America's favour because of higher fertility rates and immigration levels. Whereas China will grow old before it grows rich, and even if Beijing can sort out its demographic problems, other problems loom on the horizon. Economic, environmental, among other things. Bear all this in mind when you hear confident predictions from the likes of Hugh White at ANU that China is on the cusp of replacing America and Australia should hop on the China bandwagon. You'll often hear